If asked to make a list of 5 things that come to mind when I say the word infrastructure, what do you write down? Are you thinking about bridges, about roads, storm drains, water treatment plants? Here we see a non-exhaustive list of physical infrastructures. They primarily keep the city running behind the scenes or have a role in facilitating some aspect of the economy. Now, think about social housing, schools, parks, etc. While there's a physical aspect to this infrastructure, it also serves a critical community need. Quite a bit of things we think about as planners have to do with the social dimension of infrastructure. This requires not only dealing with the planning and design part of the physical dimensions, but also consideration of health, equity, justice, and fair access. Take a look at what I mean by health and access.
Study after study has shown that the more open space and the more dedication of park space that you have, the healthier your community will be. Because you have free access to outdoor recreation, you have free access to open space, and with that access you can do a variety of things in terms of exercising.
If people live close to parks, they're more likely to exercise. Parks are a really important piece of a strategy for helping to reduce these great health challenges.
The work we're doing is using a geospatial analysis to see the percentage of people that live within half a mile of a park and can access it. And what we've seen in our work is that when there are higher concentrations of people who live closer to a park, they're more likely to have better mental health, better physical health, lower levels of obesity. There's no other health intervention that can give us those sorts of benefits.
From our standpoint, parks are as important a piece of infrastructure as schools, as roads, as bridges. We need parks, we need places like this to create a healthy city and to create healthy citizenry.
There are significant planning differences between physical and social infrastructure. Physical infrastructure typically requires large-scale capital investments at the very beginning of the project. If we contemplate something like a sewer plant, there's a lot that goes into it and a lot of investment that's required just to get the facility online. We have pipes in the ground that run to customers' houses. Those connections are made then to a physical plant. We have the land that is required to build the physical plant, and then the structure itself. All of this requires a significant amount of money at the very beginning of the project. After that, running the facility is a fairly minor cost in comparison to developing the facility itself. There are similarities too. Physical and social infrastructure both are composed of discrete activities. That is, activities that are dedicated to that specific facility. So obviously we know what a sewage treatment plant does, and we know what a school does, and each of these things are not intermixed. They do their own specific activity, but they do this with much different funding systems. We get the funding for sewage treatment plants and other physical infrastructure from a different place and fund in a different way than we do for schools and police and social services. We'll talk more about those differences later on. Typically, physical infrastructure will meet a generalized impersonal need with undifferentiated services. That is, the services that are provided by physical infrastructure, again like a sewage plant, are provided without any differences to all of the customers that are connected to that sewer treatment plant. Everybody in a city will receive the same sewage treatment services as everybody else in the city, as long as you're connected to the city's sewage treatment system. On the other hand, everyone in the city does not receive the same social services from infrastructure. Schools throughout the city can be much different, and they serve a different set of needs depending on the specific makeup of a community. because of those individual differences, or at least differentiation between different communities, the demand for social infrastructure varies greatly. The provision of those services changes with each community, and so there's a lot more components that go into the planning process. When planning for a school, the process behind that is much different than what it takes to plan for a sewage treatment plant. And this leads us to the uncertainty when it comes to forecasting the demand for infrastructure. When we forecast the demand for physical infrastructure, it's pretty straightforward. How many buildings do we plan to have within the next 20 to 30 years? All buildings require some access to roads, some access to sewage, to water, to electricity. So figuring out what that physical demand is pretty straightforward. On the other hand, figuring out what the demand for social infrastructure will be over a planning horizon is much more difficult. Should we plan for one large school that will serve the community as a feeder, or should we have individual schools that will serve specific needs within a community? Not only that, but the community itself will vary over time. Will your neighborhood look the same in 30 to 50 years as it does now? Undoubtedly, it will change. So for a planning time horizon, figuring out what will be demanded in terms of social infrastructure over time is much more difficult to do. Add to that some social infrastructure serves a leisure or recreational purpose. How people recreate over time and how they choose to spend their time and where they choose to spend their time and even how much time they have for recreation changes dramatically from decade to decade. If we're looking out over 40 years, what people demand now in terms of recreational provision can be much different than what people demand in the future. So things like parks and community facilities will change over time, and it's very difficult to provide for those services over time.
An important aspect of this course is sustainability. The word itself gets brandished about a lot, and in some ways is lost a bit of meaning in the same way that using the word green to describe environmentally friendly processes or natural to describe healthy foods are somewhat meaningless in a variety of contexts. For infrastructure planning, it is really more a way of thinking about the infrastructure itself and its relationship to the built environment and society. From a purely engineering point of view, infrastructure should dependably accomplish the purpose of that thing. For a road, maybe it's whether the road will facilitate a certain traffic flow, or if a sewer pipe has the diameter to manage peak demand. We have to incorporate a more holistic approach. This includes economic impacts, both in terms of the cost to build and operate the infrastructure, but also the potential for revenue generation or economic contribution. We must also consider environmental impacts of that infrastructure project. Many large-scale projects and even some smaller ones can have a significant environmental impact. An assessment of environmental effects, an AEE, is required by the Resource Management Act of 1991, the RMA, in order to obtain a resource consent. Of course, the social dimensions of the infrastructure are also important to consider, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And finally, political feasibility or desirability. As a planner, it's really easy sometimes to overlook the political dimension of planning, but it's something we really have to deal with on a regular basis. Even our best plans can be laid to waste by politics, whether or not those political arguments are really about the infrastructure itself.